Peppa Pig The Dark Night. One evening, Peppa's family was getting ready for bed. The wind howled outside, and the sky was covered in dark clouds. "What a creepy wind," Mummy Pig said, closing the curtains. "I'm not scared at all," Peppa declared, trying to sound brave. Daddy Pig chuckled. "Well then, good night, Peppa." But the night would be far from peaceful. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard a faint whisper. "Peppa, Peppa." She got out of bed and looked out the window. There was no one outside, only the swing in the yard, swaying slowly on its own. Feeling uneasy, Peppa decided to check if everything was okay. She tiptoed through the house and noticed that George's door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she saw George sitting on the floor. His face was hidden in shadow, and his toys were arranged in a strange circle. "George, what are you doing?" Peppa asked. George slowly lifted his head. His eyes looked dark, and his voice sounded hollow. "Playing." A chill ran down Peppa's spine. Returning to her room, Peppa heard a noise coming from the living room. She crept downstairs and saw the television had turned on by itself. Strange, blurry images flickered on the screen. Suddenly, the screen went black, and a familiar voice came from the speakers. "Why aren't you asleep, Peppa?" It was Daddy Pig's voice, but it sounded unnatural, as if someone was imitating him. The next morning, Peppa's family acted strangely. Mummy Pig silently prepared breakfast, and Daddy Pig stared out the window without moving. When Peppa asked if everything was okay, they replied in unison, "Everything's fine, dear." George barely spoke. His toys were now always arranged in the same circle Peppa had seen during the night. Later that evening, Peppa heard whispering again. This time it came from outside her bedroom door. She opened it slowly and saw her entire family standing in the hallway, staring at her. Their faces were blank, with distorted smiles. "Peppa, it's time for bed," they said in unison. Peppa backed away, but her parents and George began moving toward her. Their shadows stretched along the walls, growing enormous and menacing. "Why are you acting like this?" Peppa screamed. Mummy Pig stepped closer and said, "Now you'll be just like us."
Peppa Pig, The Wrong Drawing. It started quietly, almost unnoticed. George was quietly sitting at the kitchen table with crayons and a large sheet of paper. Daddy Pig was sipping tea. Mummy Pig was reading a magazine. Peppa came closer and saw George was drawing children. "Is that your class?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded. "All of them." In the drawing stood Rebecca, Zoe, Pedro, Danny, everyone Peppa knew. But they all had the same eyes, black dots. Their smiles were long and flat. They stood in the same pose, arms hanging down, on a white background. Even George's dinosaur was drawn, a bit to the side and with the same eyes. "Why are you drawing them?" "Just so they'll be here, always." Peppa frowned, but said nothing. The next morning at school, the teacher said Rebecca didn't come in, then Zoe didn't come, then Pedro. Every day someone was missing. No explanations, no notes from parents. "Maybe they're sick," said Mummy Pig. "All at once," Peppa whispered. One evening, she walked into George's room and saw him drawing again. Another sheet, the same figures, the same emptiness. But now there were shadows in the background, long, like the sun was shining from behind, and their eyes were different, darker, deeper. "What is this?" "They're standing, still. You didn't draw me too, did you?" He didn't answer. Peppa went to the drawer and pulled out the old drawings, all the same, and each time, someone disappeared in real life, but appeared again on paper. That night, she woke up. The nightlight flickered. The room was cold. George was standing at the door, holding a piece of paper in his hooves. "I drew you," he said. "George, please." Peppa's heart started to pound. "You're standing in the back of the class. next to Rebecca. "I don't want to. I shouldn't be there." Too late. He stepped closer, showed her the drawing. Peppa looked at her image. It was empty. No eyes, no mouth, just a silhouette. And at the bottom of the page, a note. "You're the last one." Peppa tore the drawing from George's hooves, ran to the kitchen, and threw it into the stove. The paper caught fire. She waited until it turned to ash. But when she turned around, George stood at the door with a new sheet. I remembered it. That night, she locked her door, shut the window, hid the crayons. But she still heard scratching on the floor. Steady, slow. In the morning, she opened the desk drawer. A paper lay there, blank. Only in the corner, a faint shadow, small, shaped like her, and a note. "It's already too late."
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, Voices on the Second Floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.
Peppa Pig The Sleep. It all began quietly. A normal day. The kitchen smelled like toast. Mummy Pig stirred her tea. Daddy Pig read the newspaper, occasionally grunting and turning a page. George was drawing a dinosaur. Peppa sat by the window. The sun looked pale, almost glassy. The sky was light, but without light, as if the day was only pretending to be day. Everything seemed normal, until the evening. George was the first to fall asleep, early. Right at the table, with his head on his arms, he didn't say a word, didn't yawn, he just closed his eyes. Peppa tried to wake him, shook his shoulder, called his name. No reaction. He was breathing calmly. His face was peaceful. Daddy Pig carried him to bed. Mummy Pig said softly, "He must be tired." But her eyes looked uneasy. The next morning, Mummy Pig didn't wake up. She lay still, as if in a deep sleep. Peppa called to her, shook her gently. Nothing, just slow breathing. Her lips slightly parted. Daddy Pig said nothing. He brought her tea. Nothing. Shook her. No response. He just stood there, staring. clutching the newspaper. The next day, Daddy Pig fell asleep too, in his chair, newspaper on his lap, eyes open. Peppa leaned in. He didn't blink, didn't move, but his chest rose and fell, as if breathing, but not on purpose. Peppa was alone. At first, she tried to follow the usual routine, made herself breakfast, sat by the window, drew pictures, talked out loud. But the house felt different. The air, heavy, the rooms, strangely empty. Her footsteps made no echo, as if the house was no longer real. She went outside. The path was clear. No footprints, no breeze. The world had stopped. Peppa knocked on neighbors' doors, called out, rang doorbells. Silence. Behind the windows, silhouettes, some lying down, some sitting, all still. Everyone was asleep. She walked through the town. It was spotless. Benches, empty, shops, open but abandoned. A shopping cart stood in the middle of an aisle, as if someone let go of it and vanished. Each day grew quieter. Even the birds had stopped singing. Every sound Peppa made felt muted. She banged on pots, bounced a ball off the wall, dropped a plate. Everything sounded distant, as if she were underwater. On the third day, she returned home, sat between her parents and George. They were still breathing, warm, but not alive. She looked in the mirror. Her reflection stared back. Same face, same eyes. She blinked, turned away, then looked back. The reflection hadn't blinked. She walked closer. It sat slightly straighter, looked deeper, still unmoving. That night, her body grew heavier. Eyes refused to stay open. Her limbs slowed. Her head dipped. But inside, a voice whispered, "Don't sleep." Peppa lay down next to George, held him, listened to him breathe, slowly, calmly. She didn't want to close her eyes, but they closed anyway. And just before she slipped away, she looked one last time at the mirror. Her reflection was still sitting there, watching her, staring straight ahead, eyes wide open, still, unblinking.
Peppa Pig, Dark Water. It started in the morning. Daddy Pig went to wash up and noticed something strange. Thick black water was coming out of the bathroom tap. It smelled faintly of smoke. At first, he thought it was just dirty pipes, but the blackness wouldn't wash away, not even with soap. Later that day, the black water appeared in the kitchen. It dripped steadily from the faucet, leaving behind oily streaks in the sink. Peppa noticed dark circles under Mummy Pig's eyes, as if she hadn't slept, though she acted like everything was fine. George became quiet. Daddy Pig stopped making jokes. That night, the room Peppa and George shared felt damp. There were no pipes there, no taps, but the air was heavy and wet. The window fogged from the inside. Drops gathered on the glass. The wallpaper began peeling at the corners. A thin black line crept in from under the bedroom door, as though water had seeped in from elsewhere. The next morning, George's skin looked darker, as if he'd gotten dirty, but it wouldn't wash off. His eyes were dim. He sat still, staring at nothing. Mummy Pig darkened first. Her pink skin turned gray, then nearly black. She tried to smile, but her mouth didn't move. By midday, she was gone. No one saw her leave. She simply wasn't there anymore. Only a damp trail remained in the hallway, leading toward the bathroom. Daddy Pig turned black by evening. He stood by the window, black tears slowly dripping from his eyes. Peppa watched from behind the door. He turned to look at her, but said nothing. A moment later, he vanished. His glasses were left on the windowsill, next to a stain that wouldn't dry, wouldn't soak in, wouldn't fade. George disappeared during the night. Peppa woke to silence. His bed was empty, his pillow damp. Beside it were tiny wet hoofprints. The bedroom door was slightly open. A thin black trail stretched from it into the dark hall. But where it led, no one could tell. Peppa was alone. She didn't cry. She simply stood in front of the mirror, watching as her hooves turned gray, then black. A moist shadow crept across her forehead. Her veins were dark. She felt no fear, only exhaustion. By morning, the house was empty. The taps were dry, every mirror fogged over. In Peppa's bedroom, one final message had been written by a finger in the window's condensation. Now we live under the skin.
Peppa Pig The Tunnel. It started on an ordinary day. Peppa and George were walking to the park. The weather was calm, the sky pale white, no sun, no rain. Peppa held George's hoof. He was quieter than usual. They passed the swings, the benches, and then George stopped. Peppa looked ahead. Between the bushes was an opening that hadn't been there before. The ground dipped slightly, like it had sunken. The entrance was low, stone-lined. Too neat, too precise. Peppa frowned. George let go of her hoof and stepped forward, without a word, calmly, as if he knew where he was going. She called out, but he was already gone. The tunnel was darker than it should have been. The light from behind didn't reach in. Peppa entered. One step, then another, until she was surrounded by thick, sticky silence. She walked along the narrow stone passage, each step echoing dull and strange, like the ground wasn't quite ground. The walls weren't wet, but they smelled of damp stone, and the air felt perfectly still, like no breeze, no echo. When Peppa stepped out, she found herself in the park. At first glance, the same one, but something was off. The trees were taller, their branches too symmetrical. The swings hung still, even with no wind. The grass was pale, the sound muffled, no birds. The park sign had the same shape, but the letters were wrong. They looked copied, like someone had drawn them from memory. She walked home. It was where it should be. Same roof, same windows, but the door hung crooked, and on it was a plaque that read, "The Pig Family," written in a style that wasn't theirs. Inside, the house smelled like home, but only in the hallway. Further in, the scent vanished. The kitchen had 3 cups, one half full, 2 empty and unwashed. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table, but when she blinked, the chair was empty. The family photos on the wall looked old. They showed her, George, Mummy, Daddy, but the faces were wrong. Office. Like someone tried to recreate them from memory. She went upstairs to her room. The toys were in the right places, but George's dinosaur had blue eyes, not black, and her favorite doll was facing the wall. She had never left it like that. Peppa opened the wardrobe. Only one dress hung inside, red, like hers, but far too big. On the windowsill lay a drawing, done in pencil. It showed the tunnel. Beneath it, a note in a child's writing, "I'm inside." In the backyard stood another tunnel, wider, not the same, but similar. Peppa peered in. Nothing, just darkness. On the ground before it sat a pale stone. Pressed into it, a small hoof print. She walked back to the park. It was still empty, but on every bench lay a toy, each one slightly wrong. A doll with 2 left legs, a bear with both eyes on one side. Returning home took longer. Each step stretched. When she arrived, the door was open. On the hallway floor, footprints, wet, leading inward. The lights were on inside, but when she called out, no one answered. By the 4th day, she stopped calling. The tunnel behind the house was gone. The photos on the wall had faded, and in her room, another dress, smaller. In the kitchen, 4 cups. One was new. On it was the name Peppa, but not in her handwriting. Sometimes at night she hears footsteps in the hallway, and a child's voice, software, not quite her own. It calls someone by name, and each time she feels more certain it's calling her.
Peppa Pig. Something in the house. The evening at the Pig household was unusually quiet. Peppa and George played in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. The dim light flickered and a strange tension filled the air. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the trees like eerie whispers in the night. Shadows from the flickering television danced against the walls, elongating into strange, distorted shapes. Then the door creaked open. Peppa turned quickly, her heartbeat quickening. The door had been closed. She was sure of it. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered, but something was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too silent, as if they glided rather than walked. Their eyes were empty, hollow voids, and their smiles were unnaturally wide, frozen in place like grotesque masks. The room grew cold. A chill seeped into Peppa's bones, numbing her fingertips. The air thickened, pressing against her chest as if the room itself were alive. George clutched his dinosaur tighter, his little fingers trembling. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unseen dread. Daddy Pig's head twisted at an impossible angle, his neck creaking and popping as he turned 180 degrees to stare at them. Mummy Pig's posture shifted unnaturally, her body bending too far forward, her arms dangling lifelessly at her sides like a broken puppet. Then came the sound. A rhythmic click-clack of hooves echoed through the hallways, slow and deliberate. The footsteps did not belong to anyone they knew. Peppa grabbed George's hand, her grip firm, and without hesitation they bolted upstairs. Their feet pounded against the wooden steps, the house groaning beneath them. Peppa reached their bedroom, yanked George inside, and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock with shaking fingers. Silence. The handle began to turn, softly at first, then with more force. Peppa pressed her back against the door, willing it to hold. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching at the wood. It was faint, methodical, like nails dragging just beneath the surface. A breathy whisper followed, an exhale too close, too deliberate. The shadows in the room began to shift, stretching along the walls in odd, angular shapes, pulsing as though the walls themselves were alive. The air grew colder still, wrapping around them like unseen fingers. Peppa felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath shallow and rapid. The house no longer felt like home. It had become something else, something dark, something watching, something waiting. And in the suffocating silence, Peppa knew they were not alone.
Peppa Pig. The Smile Game. It all started on an ordinary day. During recess, under a grey sky, the children were playing in the schoolyard. Peppa sat on a bench next to Susie. Rebecca was building a tower out of sticks. Danny was chasing a ball. And Candy just stood there, watching, for a long time, without blinking. Then she said, "Let's play a game. Who can smile the longest?" Everyone laughed. "But there are rules," she added. "No blinking, no looking away, and no stopping." "What's the prize?" asked Pedro. Candy smiled. "The winner stays." They stood in a circle. 6 children, 6 faces, 6 smiles. At first it was fun. They giggled, made faces. Someone even sneezed from laughing too hard. But soon the silence thickened. The smiles froze. Their eyes grew tense. Time seemed to slow down. No one knew how long they had been standing there. Seconds? Minutes? Pedro gave up first. He squinted and turned away. Then Rebecca. Her eyes were watering. She blinked, almost with relief. 3 remained: Peppa, Susie, and Candy. No one spoke, only smiles, only staring eyes. Susie blinked. Candy won. But she didn't stop smiling, even when the game was over. The next day, Susie didn't come to school. "She's sick," said the teacher. But she said it too quickly. No details. Pedro was gone too, and Rebecca. Candy sat at her desk, the same smile on her face. She didn't blink the entire lesson. She wrote, ate, breathed, without blinking. Even when others whispered, even when the teacher called her name, she just stared and smiled. At recess, Peppa approached her. "Where's Susie?" she whispered. Candy slowly turned her head and smiled even wider. So wide her cheeks looked stretched. No words, no blinking. That evening, Peppa couldn't eat. She kept remembering the circle, the eyes, the smiles, how hard it was to breathe when no one was laughing, just holding their faces. Her mother noticed. "Everything okay, Peppa? If someone smiles too long, is that normal?" Mummy paused. "It just means they're very happy," she said, and turned away. That night, Peppa woke up. A rustling sound outside her window. She got up and looked into the dark. At the edge of the road, beneath the street lamp, sat Candy. The same smile, the same wide eyes, 2 white teeth, too still. Peppa backed away, closed the curtains, went to the mirror in her room, looked at her own face, and for a moment, her reflection smiled before she did. The next morning, Candy wasn't at school, but on Peppa's desk lay a white sheet of paper. On it, a circle. Inside, a face. Too simple, too wide a smile, black dot eyes. And beneath it, in thin writing, "Now you." When Peppa looked up, the classroom was empty, except for the mirror in the corner, and in it, her reflection, already smiling.